through daring do. They were brave, returning heroes who had saved Port Royal, but the threat was not yet past. No, they had to be vigilant. The city must rally together in this time of need, and those 1 out of every 10 slaves, well, they have to return. They have to help bolster the defenses of Port Royal. Every man and woman must contribute to the fund needed to defend their home. Now right here, the council saw their opportunity, and they struck. They commended the brave returning heroes, they seconded their plan to defend the city, and they reinstated their council and all of their powers. After all, in this time of threat from abroad, they all needed to be strong. Those councilmen had to have the authority to do their duty, which had been so short-sightedly diminished by the crown. So the council used this entirely non-existent crisis to reform and regain their power. There was little, though, that Morgan or Carlisle, the governor, could do. If they tried to point out that there was no reason for the council to reinstate itself and give themselves back their power, well, that would unmask their own ruse. No, they didn't do this without need. There were reports coming from England and France that, well, the French still had an interest in Jamaica, but there was a more pressing threat. The Spanish were rising up and causing some real trouble in the region. They had small flotas out in force, attacking French and English ships across the West Indies. Now, mostly they were attacking pirates. That was what they were there to do. But those attacks had begun to fall more and more on legitimate privateers and even merchant vessels and occasionally a Coast Guard ship. See, there was a little trouble with English pirates starting up. Those lumber camps in the Bay of Campeche were being harassed by the Spanish, so combined forces of English and Dutch logwood cutters were attacking Spanish vessels and even Campeche itself. Peter Harris had begun raiding alongside Richard Sawkins. Edward Davis and John Cook had started causing trouble, and John Coxon was calling for a meeting somewhere in the West Indies, but neither Morgan nor Carlisle could discover exactly where that was. So Morgan sent out ships to intercept those English pirates. They had to be stopped, and stopped from giving England a bad name, but he didn't have much luck apprehending them. See, Morgan hadn't been a buccaneer for a long time. He was out of the loop. He didn't know where those ships liked to sail and where they liked to meet anymore. But then they had trouble with those Spanish flotas. Those Spanish Coast Guard vessels had a habit of attacking any English ship they saw, even those that were sent out by Morgan. I mean, he might be the lieutenant governor of Jamaica now, he might be a pirate hunter now, but the men in charge of those Spanish ships remembered well a time when Morgan attacked their cities. I mean, if you were being threatened by a pack of wild dogs, would you trust another wild dog to come save you? So, things got tense. It got to a point where war seemed imminent. There were small naval engagements between the French and the Dutch and the English and the Spanish in all manner of combinations. It seemed like those peace treaties signed after the Anglo-Dutch War were about to be thrown out the window. And then John Coxon, along with a fleet of many, many other captains, sacked Portobello. But then, after Portobello was taken, well, the English pirates disappeared. Nobody knew exactly what had happened to them. Most people assumed that they found some place to lay low. Of course, we know now that they had crossed the isthmus. They were down in the Southern Ocean, causing all sorts of trouble. Meanwhile, though, that official French fleet, that delegation which had landed on Jamaica asking for aid, well, they were busy terrorizing the Spanish. They were raiding Spanish shipping lines and terrorizing cities all along the mainland. Now, while John Coxon and his fleet were away in the Pacific raiding the coast of South America, the English pirate presence in the West Indies was almost non-existent. There were virtually no English pirates of consequence sailing those waters. That crew that Morgan duped into getting drunk and confessing their crimes, well, that was typical of the quality of English rovers back in those days. But the French pirates and their Dutch compatriots, they were something else. Many of them we've already met, in the future, as it were. Several of those pirates who would sail alongside John Cook and Edward Davis when they returned from the Pacific some 3 years from now, Those were among the French pirates, men like Jan Willems, Jean Rose, and Jean Tristan. Those were veteran privateers who turned to piracy. And there were many others sailing around at that same time, but 3 captains stand out. 3 captains who I have criminally underserved while our story took us to the Pacific. There was Laurent de Graaf, Nicholas von Horn, and Michel de Gramont. Now, we'll look closely at their exploits next time, but for now, it's important to remember that they're raising Cain all across the West Indies. All 4 of the major powers, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and the English, they all had ships out searching for those 3 privateers who were killing men, taking ships, burning cities. Those 4 powers, though, they were all technically at peace, but while they were out searching for those 3 pirates, they kept shooting at each other. They would capture innocent sailors. The French would capture Spaniards. The Dutch would capture Englishmen. It became this dance of violence and mistakes that, it looked very much like a war. It wasn't. These were peacetime maneuvers. They were just policing the seas, but if you were living through it, it might be hard to tell the difference. What's impressive to me, though, is that while all this is going on, while men are being captured and killed, cities are being burned, those 3 pirates and those other lesser-known names, they were mostly able to just dance away unscathed. This was a problem. It was a major problem for the French and the Spanish, but it was also troubling to Henry Morgan and Governor Carver. You see, they were, for a change, actually trying to curb piracy, and it should have looked like they were doing well. Since nobody yet knew about John Coxon and Bartholomew Sharp and their actions, it looked like the English were laying low and not causing too much trouble. But those foreign pirates and those foreign navies were causing England so much trouble that it looked like they were losing a war that they weren't even technically fighting. And then there were problems with the council. They were trying once again to wrest their power away from Carlisle, away from the crown. So Carlisle had his hands full countering those actions, and normally Morgan would be able to occasionally loom up and remind everybody that he had the militia and nobody better screw with him, and they'd back down and continue their dance. But for the time being, Morgan had his own hands full. He was embroiled in a legal dispute, bridging the Atlantic Ocean. Now, it wasn't about the Buccaneers of America, not yet. This involved a man named Francis Mingham. See, a few months earlier, a harbor master in Port Royal had brought to Morgan's attention his belief that a captain, Francis Mingham, had failed to account for some of his cargo. He alleged that Mingham had attempted to smuggle several casks of rum and 2 casks of a very expensive cherry brandy without paying those proper fees. Now, if this was true, it was just smuggling. Morgan heard the case and ruled in favor of the harbor master's allegations. Francis Mingham had his cargo seized and his ship impounded, and the cargo, even that expensive French brandy, just disappeared. But his ship was sold off. Mingham was not arrested, but he had lost basically everything, and he was understandably upset. So he took passage back to England, where he met with members of the Privy Council, and he laid before them the charge that he had been wrongfully robbed by Morgan. This led to a libel suit against Morgan and that harbor master. Now, normally this wouldn't be a huge problem. In most cases like this, gentlemen come to an arrangement. It's that position, and some money would change hands, and all of this would go easy. But not with Morgan. You see, first of all, he was stubborn and he was prideful. He was furious that Mingham had impugned his honor. He was absolutely unwilling to settle out of court and have his name dragged through the dirt. Governor Carlisle even begged him to settle out of court and pay some of those costs himself, but Morgan said no, he wanted this to be settled publicly. Unfortunately, for Morgan at least, this was a hard case to win. He was, in his past, a well-known pilot. I mean, it's not like he had stolen ships before. It's not like he had taken men's rum and brandy before. What's to say that he hadn't just figured out how to do it from a barrister's bench rather than the deck of a ship. So there was a lot of back and forth. There were suits and countersuits and